Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this commentary on the sixth lecture of Myths and Mysteries of Egypt. Rudolf Steiner has been describing what happened on Earth when first the sun and then the moon separated from it. So let's briefly go back to this cosmic process and return with clairvoyant vision to the first half of the Hyperborean era, when both the sun and the moon were inside the mass of the Earth. Here you can see this reference diagram, which is our guide through the description made by Rudolf Steiner. It is taken from Gaia Sophia by Kees Zertman, and we can read its title, Creation and Descent of Individual Germs to the Lower Spiritual Levels from the 169th to the 172nd condition of form. In particular, it shows a summary of the stages of development of the Earth and of the different types of ether during the 172nd condition of form, what we call the 7 eras of the Earth. Rudolf Steiner talked about the first 3, the Polarian era, and above all, the Hyperborean and Lemurian eras, after having described in quite a detail the 4th era, that of Atlantis. Here you can see them all summarized from the point of view of the process of formation of the ethers on the one side and on the other of differentiation of the elements. So, going back to the Polarian era, all substance was in a completely supersensible state in the life ether. So we would not have found the realms of nature as we know them today, clearly differentiated, because everything was in the life ether. The animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms were therefore in potential. They were already contained in this primordial stage of the earth, but lying in a dormant state. Thus, in the Polarian era, everything was human beings. They were eggs. These human beings were like eggs or seeds, and inside them were the seeds of future humanity, of the future animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms. Then gradually, as we passed from the Polarian era to the Hyperborean era and the sun began to separate, the seeds of animals also developed, became active and acquired movement. Only when the sun detached itself completely from the earth, shining from above the Earth-Moon mass, did the seeds of plants begin to develop and be vivified, because the right conditions for this to occur came into place. And when the moon also separated from the earth, the mineral germs began to develop as the forces that were needed for the progressive hardening of the mineral kingdom became available with the departure of the moon. We are still in a supersensible evolution that will give rise to the sense-physical evolution, what can be investigated also by natural science. The Earth, when still containing the 2 luminaries, the Sun and the Moon, was an etheric nebula that extended to the current orbit of Saturn. We are in the Polarian era, and then, once Saturn separated in the Polarian era, the nebula came to extend up to the current orbit of Jupiter in the Hyperborean era. So we said that the human germs contained within themselves the kingdoms of nature, and these germs were as yet non-differentiated, spheres of etheric life that later differentiated into etheric air, life ether, sound ether. This you can see below in the bottom part of this diagram, life ether and then etheric air, life ether and chemical ether or sound ether. At that time, there were no organs that could perceive all these processes of development and evolution. So what Steiner describes can only be seen thanks to a clairvoyant eye that opens onto a cosmic space, accessing the Akashic records of the corresponding stages. In other words, reading the chronicles of nature in the corresponding stages, which were not even physical yet. In the primordial days of the Earth, in the Polarian era, ancient Saturn is recapitulated. Therefore, there is no light. In the Hyperborean era, ancient Sun is recapitulated and light gradually appears. So, initially, it was impossible for the eye and the sense of sight to exist because there was no light. The eye develops thanks to light, sight develops thanks to light. So the eye develops only when the recapitulation of ancient Saturn in heat is finished, and that of ancient Sun begins in light, when an etheric light gradually appears. A luminous sphere is formed of etheric mist, a luminous nebula of ether. Thus, passing into the Hyperborean era, etheric light also differentiates, and therefore this etheric nebula shines with light. From heat, light. From darkness, light. A sphere is formed of luminous vapor, warm in its center, which heated the space from the inside outwards, expanding and containing within it the seeds of the kingdoms of nature. Within this nebula, this sphere of luminous vapor, were all the substances that would later differentiate from the most subtle to the most solid: gases, air, liquids, water, and solids, earth. These would then come into being first in a supersensible sense, thus at their densest in an etheric state, and then they would manifest progressively in a reverse sequence in the sense physical reality, in the material world investigated by natural science, that is. So, in the Hyperborean era, with the progressive departure of the Sun, we have a first differentiation. Etheric air is formed and etheric water. With the Lemurian era and the gradual departure of the Moon, we have a subsequent differentiation, and thus solid, liquid, and air are formed, together with the other four ethers: heat, light, sound, and life. In a more general sense, we can say that supersensibly, life ether develops first, then sound ether or chemical ether, then light ether, heat ether, physical heat, air or gas, liquids or water, and lastly earth or solids. This means that when all this manifests itself in the sense physical, the sequence is reversed. So first we have what is called, in an illusionary form, the atom, which is in fact already in a solid condition. It is already something that can be detected, for example, by physical instruments. And from there, it is overturned. So we can say that from this primordial substance in which there are solids, liquids, and gases, there is an increase in differentiation of gas, liquids, and solids. And at the same time, heat, light, sound, and life, which is the last to appear physically. Thus, the process is completely overturned. What we read here in the table at the bottom, where you see the maximum differentiation in these 7 stages, is that in a supersensible sense, the process takes place starting from life. You see that the life ether is present at the beginning. And in a sense physical sense, therefore also in the natural scientific investigation, the process takes place in a reversed order. Life appears last, while what appeared last in a supersensible sense appears first. It's completely reversed. Life appears first in a supersensible sense, and from this everything that we call, in quotation marks, known life, differentiates, while in a sense physical sense, first what we improperly call known life arises, and then eventually life. As the Moon departed, the forces that would slow down the process of evolution left the mass of the Earth together with the Moon. This way, Earth was able to free itself from the regressive forces that were holding back earthly evolution itself. However, we must not consider the moon only in a negative sense. The moon was unsuitable for the evolution of earthly beings. We need to start from this point of view. The Earth was the center of all the evolutionary deeds of the hierarchies. So it was necessary that the hierarchies that were suitable for the moon should leave, as had been the case with those of the sun. In this way, the Earth was able to free itself first from the overly progressive forces of the sun, which accelerated the evolution of the Earth too much, and then, with the departure of the moon, it was able to free itself from the overly regressive, hardening forces that held back the evolution of Earth. Thus, the necessary balance between Sun, Earth, and Moon was achieved. As Steiner says here, we must not consider the Moon only in a negative sense. We can say that the Moon has in itself a polarity, and that it shows all the intermediate stages between one polarity and the other, between a white polarity and a black one, a luminous one and a dark one. So, the moon was unsuitable for the evolution of terrestrial beings because the lunar, astral, etheric, and physical were already too rigid compared to those of the Earth. So much so that today there is manifest life on Earth and highly articulated too, as we know, unicellular, multicellular, plants, animals, and so on. While this is not true for the moon, at least in an exterior form. The moon is therefore expelled so that the beings of the moon can find on it their own dimension for evolution, which will be taken care of by that spirit of the form we have called Jehovah or Yahweh. Thus, the moon becomes the place of purification. It becomes a purgatory, in fact, which is what occurs both during our sleeping, dreaming life. The moon is the sphere in which we live compensatory dreams, purgative dreams, so to speak, and in the afterlife of the deceased, when they pass through purgatory, also called Kamaloka in Sanskrit. The beings that dwell on the moon are gradually purified of their desires. This is because in the cosmic substance one tries, so to speak, not to waste anything. Let's say they are in an ecosophy, a spiritual ecology. They are eco-sustainable, ante litteram, so to speak, in the sense that everything that can be used, that can really be used, not in any greenwashing sense, everything that can be used is used, meaning that it is actually brought back to regular evolution. So the moon, the place of purification, is also called the stronghold of the moon, and it has to do with the image of Dante's Purgatory, even though in his poem it is located on earth. It is that part of the earth that, as Ars bemol chasm, has moved away from the mass of the earth after the fall of Lucifer. So, as in imagination, this does have a reference to the other one. Mount Purgatory is like a stronghold. In there, the base desires, what in the Middle Ages were referred to as the 7 deadly sins, become purified and are gradually transformed into the corresponding virtues. Why are they 7? Because on the moon, all spiritual influences reverberate and are reflected. And so on the moon, we find the essence of all celestial spheres spheres reflecting their light, that is the spiritual influence, onto the moon. And so on the moon we find everything from Saturn to the moon itself. We find the spiritual influences that here are purified of their, shall we say, lower form. The lowest will become, as they purify themselves, a higher form, the regular form for their evolution. Esoterically speaking, the place of purification in the stronghold of the moon is called white moon. It is the part of the moon that receives wise guidance from the forces emanating from the sun, thanks to Jehovah. Jehovah takes the forces emanating from the sun and brings them to the moon. These are then reflected onto the earth, and we will see in this lecture that Rudolf Steiner tells us that the being who reflects the forces of the sun from the moon to the earth is Osiris, the one that was called Osiris by the Egyptians. In fact, all human beings who have lagged behind in evolution are connected without exception to entities of the higher hierarchies who lead them to purification. These higher hierarchies of the moon, whom we can call also the wise masters of the moon, guide the evolution of the regressive lunar beings with such strength that they can draw wisdom, beauty, and goodness from their deteriorated physical, etheric, and astral. They are able to turn that regressive part into progressive part, and this purification of the moon itself constitutes the white moon. We can say that it is the solarized part of the moon, which then manifests itself in the full moon. Thus, even the beings of the most retrograde forces are led to the greater good. Jehovah, the sublime entity, spirit of the form, healer of the moon, directs the angels of the moon, the masters of the lunar stronghold, with its inner strength, guiding them to purify the beings of the moon who have been left behind. So you understand well that it was only thanks to the sacrifice of the spirit of the moon, Jehovah, that the rectification of the beings who had been left behind, who had become too hardened, was made possible within the mass of the moon. On the other hand, if they had never left the earth to its own evolution, their purification wouldn't have been possible, just as the regular evolution of Earth and its being wouldn't have been possible. Therefore, everything is placed in its proper evolutionary progression. Whereas, to the extent that there are lunar beings who refuse purification, who become even more rigid and deny themselves the wise guidance of Jehovah and the angels of the moon, the other pole of the moon is formed, which, from a point of view of forces, it amounts to 1/3, and is called black moon or eighth sphere, which is the side of the moon that is never illuminated by the light of the sun. In there nest these spirits who resist the purification carried out by Jehovah and the lunar angels. It is the dark side of the moon that never shows itself to the forces emanated from the sun. We can say that it is the attachment, the point of connection of the eighth sphere, which in itself, however, is wider. You must imagine that the eighth sphere comprises the entire orbit of the black moon, of the dark side of the moon. It envelops the whole Earth and is essentially the orbit of the moon, which encompasses the whole Earth in a sphere. This black moon is also called Lilith, while the other one, the white moon, can be called Eve. That part of Eve Sophia, who like a mother leads her children to evolve towards the light. So much so that this image that we can call Eve, Maria, Sophia also appears as the all-forgiving mother. In the Catholic cult, for example, she appears as the all-forgiving mother, that is, the one who, despite the fact that they turn against her very being, this feminine part is the soul of human beings, forgives all and allows, through forgiveness, the rectification, the return to regular evolution. This is the maternal aspect of the moon, while the aspect of the one who is also called the mother of abortions is Lilith, the black moon. It is the stepmother, let's say, who continually tries to devour her children, and the children she devours are precisely these spirits of the moon who resist purification, who try not to be purified. By the way, today, in the context of neopaganism, there is enormous confusion between Lilith and the new moon, which become somehow superimposed. This is not the case at all. The new moon is part of the cycle of purification. It is, we could say, formed by those beings that start from darkness and are gradually brought to the light. Whereas Lilith, the black moon, is the moon that does not want to be purified. Of course, here too we talk about the dark side of the mother, who is also the black Madonna. But that is a primordial mother who has not yet been illuminated by the forces of the sun, and who, little by little, will be. Lilith is different. She does not want to be illuminated by the forces of the sun, but rather seeks to destroy them. Everything of the substance of the moon that is purified will form the white moon. In this way, it will be brought back to regular evolution, reuniting with the Earth and thus becoming part of future Jupiter. Everything that resists purification, on the other hand, will be expelled into the eighth sphere when this is completely formed, and which we can also call, in a more occult sense, black moon. However, keep in mind that on the current moon, the black moon is only that part which is not exposed to sunlight and which is the point of origin of what will be the eighth sphere in its complete maturity. And what will happen then? It will be expelled towards the end of future Venus, or on the sixth metamorphosis, on the sixth condition of life, on the sixth condition of form. 6, 6, 6. Going back to primordial times, human beings were not yet in a material state, but in a supersensible state. We saw at first that they were similar to a flower, as Steiner told us, and after that to a fish. Man flower or plant man, fish man. The higher half of the human being was exposed to the forces of the sun, above the surface of the waters, and the lower half of the human being had developed in the water that grew down into the abyss. If the moon had not separated from the earth, man would have remained in this form of fish man, which, as we said, was also the supersensible archetype of those creatures that will appear then, in a physical sense, as fish. On the other hand, the upper half of the human being would have evolved by spiritualizing itself at a speed greater than that of the earth because of the influence of the sun. Therefore, human beings would not have had any fixed form capable of hosting an earthly experience. the solar force would have prevailed in the upper half of man. On the other hand, the moon would have acted by hardening the lower half of man, crystallizing it excessively until finally this part would have emancipated. Therefore, the upper part would have spiritualized quickly without taking on a form capable of having an earthly experience, and the lower part would have stiffened to the point of emancipating itself from the upper part. They would then have separated from each other into two entities. They would have become like a mummy in the lower part, incapable of having an earthly experience. This is why, for its own healthy earthly evolution, then the human being needed that both luminaries be outside the earth, and this be situated between the moon that hardens, fixing its shape, and the sun that continually spiritualizes all forms. A decelerator, the moon, and an accelerator, the sun. Thus the moon is expelled, and together with the sun they alternate in their action in human earthly evolution, and consequently also nature, contributing to healthy human evolution, which will mean the gradual expulsion of the kingdoms of nature, the archetypes of animals, the archetypes of plants, and the archetypes of minerals progressively. These will then appear in reverse order in the physical evolution, to make it simple. Obviously, these phases will overlap in part. It's not that all the minerals appear first, then all the plants, then all the animals. It's just to have the understanding that they appear in reverse progression. First, a sort of tail of all minerals, then a tail of plants overlaps, and then a tail of animals overlaps again. This is how the moon and the sun contribute to the healthy evolution of humanity and of the kingdoms of nature, because nature is nothing more than the organs of man spread out in the cosmos. Thus we see that the divine wisdom that permeates the entire cosmos arranges relationships. Not only does it arrange individual celestial bodies, but also the relationships between the different celestial bodies, that are the bodies of the hierarchies, so that these are in mutual harmony, a cosmic harmony that we call more specifically the harmony of the music of the spheres. All this comes into being as a symphony that has also elements, we might say, of disharmonious distortion, which, however, in the long run of evolution create new harmonics. And that distortion is the role of evil. The ancient Egyptians understood this principle of divine wisdom becoming cosmic harmony through the myth of the god Osiris. For the ancient Egyptian, Osiris was the god of the sun, from whom the solar forces emanated at the time when earth and sun were still united. We're talking of the time up to the first half of the Hyperborean era, before the breathing of air in the lungs began, when Osiris and Set, who were brothers, separated. When Osiris, with his solar light, withdrew from the lungs of the human being, acting as sunlight from outside the human being, Set, or Typhon, breathed air into the lungs of the human being for the first time. In that same moment, the consciousness of birth and death was born. Now that the sun was shining completely above the human being on the upper half of his body, the human being realized that these forces could not penetrate the depth of its lower half. It then realized that the lower half of its body had remained in darkness, and now, little by little, it became aware of its own eye. That is, the more the human being, in the grace of the solar forces, immersed itself in the darkness of its lower nature, conditioned by the lunar forces that were still in the earth, the more it became conscious. When the mass of the sun emerged from the mass of the earth, the divine presence of Osiris began to be eclipsed on earth. The mass of the moon and the earth were still united when the human being began to breathe air, and Osiris brought with him the force of the light of the sun that was in the earth. When the moon separated from the earth, Osiris joined the moon, together with Jehovah. From that moment on, Osiris was on the moon, and from there he directed the light of the sun, which, reflected by the mirror of the moon, was sent to earth. So Jehovah takes the light of the sun and brings it to the moon. Osiris takes the light of the sun reflected on the moon and brings it to earth. And he works together with Jehovah. In the myth of Osiris, after Seth kills his brother, Osiris is locked up in a sarcophagus. This sarcophagus is the moon, which means that Osiris retreats with the moon. It is also said that Osiris becomes lord of the underworld, where souls are purified, namely the moon. This is after his death, after his brother Seth killed him. In this way, the human being who used to receive the forces of Osiris from the sun within the earth now received them from Osiris from the moon. And so Steiner reports the ancient Egyptians turned to the moon saying, "Osiris, it is you who radiate upon me from the moon the light of the sun, the essence of your being." In an initiatory sense, this is one of the ways to understand the myth of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Seth. The light of the moon is the light of the sun reflected according to a cycle of 2 times 14 days, for a total of 28 days. There are 4 phases of the moon: waxing moon, which leads to full moon, then waning moon, which leads to new moon. This means that for 14 days, Osiris turns to the earth in 14 increasing degrees of light, after which the full moon disk appears. So, in the 14 degrees that the moon takes to go from crescent to full, the forces of Osiris increase. It's the intensification of the forces of Osiris. For 14 days, Osiris turns to earth gradually. Just like as a reflection, the process of breathing is formed in the human being. Only when the complete cycle of 14 degrees appeared from the crescent moon to the full moon, were the forces of Osiris complete, and the human being came to breathe air, thus uniting with the sense physical world. We can say that at this point Osiris is fragmented into 14 pieces, as stated in the myth. Thus, the primordial ego was born in the human soul thanks to the reflection of the cosmic forces of the moon. The ancient Egyptians heard all of this in the myth. This was recounted in the form of a story told to the people, while it was experienced as a formative process of the human being by the initiates, the priests, the pharaohs, and the queen. Each with their own point of view, of course. The priests were able to transmit this initiation. The pharaoh experienced it from the point of view of Osiris, and the queen from the point of view of Isis. In the myth, it is said that Osiris reigned wisely as pharaoh on earth and led ancient Egypt to its golden age, to the solar age, in which all nature was fertile and humanity did not need to cultivate the land. Nature gave of itself in abundance. Then the air separated from the waters, and Osiris' brother Set, the desert wind, arrived, bringing death with it. Set wanted to rule Egypt in his brother's stead, certain that he could be a powerful pharaoh. So he deceived Osiris, overpowered him, and killed him. He then placed him in a sarcophagus designed for him and threw him into the sea. The sarcophagus is the moon in which Osiris is imprisoned, and in fact Osiris united with the moon when the moon left Earth. The sarcophagus moon was pushed into the sea of the cosmos in the vast cosmic spaces. Then Osiris was found, but he was already divided into 14 pieces, which are the degrees of the moon from crescent to full moon. These 14 pieces of Osiris were buried in 14 temples in Egypt, as we saw during our trip to Egypt. The 14 pieces of Osiris' body are the 14 degrees of the moon, from crescent to full. So that Osiris, at the height of his intensity, is the full moon. Reflecting the sun's rays on the earth, it acts as a cosmic mirror. Thus, only when the sun leaves the earth and the moon also leaves the earth can the moon acquire all its phases, which are a living relationship between sun, moon, and earth. This made it so that the 14 degrees of its waxing came to regulate human breathing in its evolution and relationship with the earth. Moreover, the forces emanating from the 14 degrees of the moon, these 14 days, laid the foundation for the spinal cord, from which the nerves branch out, spreading throughout the human body. So, 14 bundles of nerves develop to form the fundamental nervous component of the spine, which is composed of a nervous part, a hematic part, which has to do with the bone marrow and the production of red blood cells, and a bone part that covers and protects the whole. The nervous part, in its segmentation, its rhythm, is linked to breathing and to the lunar cycle. The 14 lunar degrees, from the crescent moon to full moon, are only half of the total 28-day cycle. So, there are 14 days of waxing moon, from the new moon to the full moon, and 14 days of waning moon, from the full moon to the new moon. So, 14 days waxing, 14 days waning, so that the waxing moon corresponds to the increasing of the forces of Osiris, reflecting on Earth the forces of the sun, while the waning moon is the decreasing of the forces of Osiris, of the reflection on Earth of the forces of the sun. At the new moon, then, the forces of Osiris are almost completely absent. Hence, this is appearance of the mirror of the moon was for the ancient Egyptians the appearance of Isis in search of the 14 pieces of her husband Osiris, to reassemble him and then give birth to Horus, their son. Thus, the 14 waning lunar phases, the days and the decreasing lunar degrees, were under the aegis of Isis, the wife of Osiris. Thus, thanks to the action of Isis, another 14 bundles of nerves formed in the spinal cord, reaching a total of 28 bundles of nerves, like the 28 days and total degrees of the 4 lunar phases, waxing, full, waning, and new. These nerve bundles, Steiner adds, would only be 28 if the lunar year coincided with the solar year. However, since the solar year is longer, additional bundles of nerves are formed. Moreover, the difference between the lunar and solar years is compensated for by the 13th holy nights, a time in which, in fact, there is a sort of suspension of this breathing of spiritual forces between sun, moon, and earth, and as a result, a time in which we can unite more powerfully with the impulse of Christ. We can say that it is as if Christ were more accessible during those 13 holy nights, because the process of sun, moon, and earth are in balance. Furthermore, up to the expulsion of the moon from the earth, there were no separate sexes. They formed as the moon moved away from the earth. Before the separation of the moon, there were a hermaphroditic human being, androgynous in soul and hermaphroditic in its body archetype. The body was simultaneously male and female. It was in the alternations of the forces of Osiris and Isis in these cycles of 14 days each that the sexes became separated in human beings, depending on whether the forces of Osiris or the forces of Isis prevailed in the human organism. Thus, although both these deities acted on the formation of the human organism, the prevalence of one over the other determined the development of a sexual pole. What does this mean? The etheric body, which is hermaphroditic, therefore has always both a male pole and a female pole, never got to express them simultaneously in the etheric, in a supersensible form that would be both male and female. Instead, one of the two poles alternately expressed itself externally in the physical body, so that the complementary pole remained in the etheric. Thus, at first, these two poles were both in the etheric at the same time, but when the physical body was generated, only one of the poles was expressed in the physical body, and the other remained in the etheric. This is recapitulated in the embryonic development of every human being. A human organism in which the forces of Isis prevail becomes male, and a human organism in which the forces of Osiris prevail becomes female. Why is this? Because the prevalence of the forces of Isis means that the masculine is sought, so the forces of Isis seek, form the masculine. Isis recomposes her husband's body. On the other hand, the forces of Osiris fecundate those of Isis, and Horus is born. It is Isis who, not finding the last piece of Osiris, generates it with magic, the golden phallus, and by uniting one last time with her husband Osiris, she gives birth to Horus. Thus, the prevalence of the forces of Osiris signifies the formation of the feminine, its fecundation, and therefore a female organism. This also means that the part of the etheric that is not expressed in the physical is the countersex, is of the complementary sex. We can say, therefore, that every human being who has expressed Osiris in a physical sense has Isis etherically within them, and vice versa, when Isis is expressed in a physical sense, Osiris is present in the etheric sense. So, a woman has a male etheric body and a man a female etheric body. A woman has Osiris within her and a man has Isis within him. This is how the cosmic forces of sun and moon, of Osiris and Isis, work in harmony in the formation of the human being. The formation of the 28 nerve bundles resulted in the external differentiation of the sexes, just as the internal action of Isis and Osiris resulted in the formation of further organs. Through the action of Osiris, the lungs were formed, which regulate the influence of Set, the earthly air, and through the internal action of Osiris, the larynx is formed, which produces speech thanks to the modulation of breath of Set, which has been received in the lungs. Therefore, lungs and larynx work together to modulate the earth's air, that is Set. We can see that Isis and Osiris work to modulate Set, and in this way a female organ, which is the lungs, is found in every human being, just as a male organ, the larynx, is found in every human being. This is how the ancient Egyptian initiates understood what to the people was conveyed as the myth of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, up to a certain degree. They could reach further experiential understanding at higher subsequent degrees. We could say that this was its physical expression. So, Osiris and Isis together generate a son, Horus, who is the creator of the future earthly man. The child Horus is raised by his mother Isis, who protects him with the wings. That is, the heart is between the lungs. Horus, who is the divine son of Osiris and Isis, in the human being is precisely the heart, protected by the wings of Isis, which are the lungs. This is how, in the myth of the union of Osiris and Isis, resides the memory of the original human being in its unitary form, masculine and feminine together. These were the mysteries of Atlantis, which are also found in the ages following the Great Flood, for example, initially in the mysteries of the Paleo-Indian epoch. Steiner has already described them. In short, they are the mysteries of Brahman. He quotes the Rig Veda. And there come over man the 7 from below, the 8 from above, the 9 from behind, the 10 from out the foundations of the rocky vault, and the 10 from within, while the mother cares for the suckling child. Steiner clarifies the meaning of this passage. We can understand it if we keep in mind how the feminine principle of Isis, the lung, comes into a relationship with the larynx, the masculine principle of Osiris. And with the lung modulating the entrance and the larynx modulating the exit of air, together they regulate the entry of the earthly forces of the air of Seth. Therefore, in the human being, moon and sun work together to regulate the entry of the forces of the air of Seth, which are the bearers of the consciousness of death, but also of the consciousness of the I. What comes this way to man are the sounds of vowels and of consonants as a whole. Thus, the primordial word, which in the Paleo-Indian epoch was called Va, is differentiated into many sounds, which are the language that is articulated through vowels and consonants. In this way, the mother Isis cares for and nourishes her child. Therefore, we're talking about the lungs and the heart, Isis being the lungs, Horus the heart. Inasmuch as words express feelings which are radiated from the heart and expressed in words as modulation of the air between the lungs and the larynx. Thus we see how, in the mystical schools of ancient Egypt, from the cosmic mysteries of sun, moon, and earth, one arrived at the mysteries of the human being through the myth of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. With this, I thank you for listening. We have concluded conference number 6. Thank you, Giorgio, and thank you all for participating. Thank you all. Have a good evening. See you soon. Happy Easter. Happy Easter. Happy Easter. Bye, everyone.